Imagine stepping off a train in 1885. Dust sticks to your tongue. The sun burns the horizon red. The smell of sweat, horsehide, and gunpowder drifts through the air, thick enough to taste. You look around, expecting the West you've seen in 100 movies. Cowboys in spotless hats, lawmen polishing their six-shooters. A duel waiting to happen at high noon, but that world doesn't exist. Not here, not anywhere. The man tipping his hat at you. He's probably a ranch hand or a farmer, not a gunslinger. That sheriff might have been an outlaw himself a few years ago. And that saloon with the swinging doors? It smells more like spilled beer and sweat than adventure. Hollywood turned this land into legend. But the real West was something else entirely. A place of mud, blood, and survival. A melting pot of dreamers, thieves, and wanderers chasing something they could never quite reach. You see, the truth doesn't look like the movies told you. Gunfights were rare, cowboys weren't all white, and most Wild West towns had more rules than freedom. Still, there's something magnetic about these myths. Maybe because they let us believe in heroes, even when history didn't have many. So today, we're taking a ride through the 11 most historically inaccurate tropes Western movies always get wrong, and by the end, you'll see that the real Wild West wasn't about glory. It was about grit. But to understand that grit, we have to scrape away the dust Hollywood left behind. To look past the heroes, the hats, and the gunsmoke, and step into the West as it truly was. Raw, unpredictable, and far less romantic than the silver screen ever showed. Because every legend starts somewhere, and most begin with a lie. We've stepped into the dust and heat of the frontier, and already the cracks in the legend are showing. Let's start with one of Hollywood's favorite illusions. One that built entire movie empires. The street is empty. Two men face each other, hands hovering over their pistols. Somewhere a tumbleweed rolls by. You've seen it 100 times. The classic showdown. The heartbeat of every Western. But here's the truth. It almost never happened. Gunfights in the Old West were rare. And when they did happen, they were messy, desperate, and fast. Not choreographed duels at noon. Most disputes were settled with fists, knives, or ambushes after dark. There wasn't time for dramatic speeches or slow walks down Main Street. In fact, many towns banned guns outright. Dodge City, Tombstone, and Abilene all had no firearms allowed signs at the edge of town. The real danger wasn't a showdown. It was a drunken argument that turned deadly before anyone could blink. Hollywood gave us heroes with perfect aim and steady hands. History gave us frightened men who shot first and prayed later. But the myth was too good to die. Because the duel wasn't just about guns, it was about honor. And once you give a story a hero, you need a uniform to match. Movies taught us that everyone in the West dressed like John Wayne. Big hats, leather boots, shiny spurs, dusters flapping in the wind. But if you really walked down a frontier street in the 1880s, you'd see something else entirely. Cowboys were a minority. Most people were miners. Railroad workers, barbers, cooks, even school teachers. And they dressed for work, not for show. Broad-brimmed hats were practical, sure, but so were bowlers, flat caps, and even top hats. Spurs clinked only on those who worked with cattle. And the iconic fringed jacket? It was more of a Hollywood costume than a frontier staple. The West was diverse, messy, and improvised, not a catwalk for cowboy fashion. Still, when audiences saw a man in a Stetson, they knew exactly who the hero was. And Hollywood loved clear symbols more than messy truth. But clothes don't just shape how we see a man. They shape how we imagine his world. And that brings us to the biggest illusion of all, the rhythm of life in the West itself. If you believe the movies, the West was a never-ending series of gunfights and chaos, a place where every day ended with a body in the dirt and a sunset over justice. But most Western towns were quiet, even dull. Days revolved around work. Herding, building, trading, and surviving. Saloons weren't stages for bar fights every night. They were social centers, more gossip than gunfire. Lawmen weren't riding out daily for shootouts either. In fact, many of them spent more time writing reports and chasing drunks than facing outlaws. The so-called Wild West had strict local laws, curfews, and even fines for swearing in public. Real life was less high noon, and more hard work. But we remember the noise, not the silence. Because silence doesn't sell tickets, and that's the genius and tragedy of the Western myth. It traded truth for legend, dust for gold, But beneath the myths, the real story still waits to be told, one where the heroes don't look like what you expect. It was written by people, by hands blistered from work, by faces Hollywood forgot to show. The classic cowboy, white hat, white hero, white face. That's what we've been shown for a century, but ride far enough into history and the picture changes. 1 in every 4 cowboys was black, Mexican, or Native American. They broke wild horses, drove cattle through storms, and risked their lives every bit as much as the men the movies made famous. Many were freed slaves chasing freedom on the open range. Some were vaqueros, Mexican horsemen who invented many of the cowboy traditions we think are American. They rode first, roped first, and taught the West what horsemanship really meant. But when Hollywood rolled its cameras, their stories were left behind. The screen turned brown dust into white legend. The real West wasn't a story of one kind of man. It was a story of many kinds of survival, and survival didn't belong only to the men. Because while the movies showed the cowboys riding, they forgot the women who built the towns they rode through. Hollywood painted them as background. The damsel, the dance girl, the wife waving from the porch. But on the real frontier, women weren't waiting for rescue. They were the rescuers. They ran boarding houses, schools, and newspapers. They nursed the sick, buried the dead, and sometimes carried guns of their own. Many homesteads survived only because a woman worked harder and longer than anyone around her. Take Mary Fields, a former slave-turned-stagecoach driver, known for fighting off bandits and wolves. Or Josephine Marcus, who shaped the legend of Wyatt Earp. They weren't ornaments in someone else's story. They were the story, but that truth didn't fit the myth. Hollywood's West needed heroes and pretty faces, not equals. Still, if you listen closely to the wind out there, you can almost hear them. The women who never waited to be saved. And as Hollywood shrank the women, it did something far worse to others. It turned whole nations into villains. For decades, the Western painted Native Americans as faceless attackers, savage, voiceless, nameless. But the truth was never that simple. They weren't the villains of the frontier. They were its first victims. While settlers claimed the land, native tribes were driven from it, forced onto reservations. Their families broken, their stories erased. Yet, on film, they became the enemy, a faceless shadow to make white heroes shine brighter. The real West wasn't about cowboys and Indians. It was about broken promises, stolen ground, and resilience that refused to die. Even now, their culture and stories remain the heartbeat of the land. Older, stronger, and truer than any reel of film could ever show. But sometimes, the lies weren't just about who was the villain. They were about who was trusted to keep the peace. The sheriff rides tall, dust on his boots, justice in his eyes. That's the Western promise, the good man with a gun. But in truth, many of those good men had darker pasts than the outlaws they chased. Wyatt Earp himself was once accused of running gambling rings. Wild Bill Hickok was a gunfighter long before he was a marshal. Law in the West was a fragile thing, held together by fear, loyalty, and whoever had the fastest draw. Sheriffs switched sides. Josés turned on their own. And justice often depended on who owned the town, not who told the truth. The badge didn't always mean righteousness. Sometimes it just meant power. Hollywood gave us white hats and black hats. History gave us a world where the gray was everywhere. And that's the real story hiding under the dust. Not heroes and villains, but people. Flawed, frightened, determined people doing whatever it took to survive the endless horizon. But myths don't fade easily, and the next ones are woven into the very way we imagine the frontier itself. We've pulled the curtain on the cowboys, the lawmen, and the myths that turned history into legend. But there's one more layer, the everyday world those people actually lived in. Because for all the bullets and bravado, the real West was built on something quieter, the small details of survival. The kind of life that never made it to the silver screen. Movies gave us chaos, saloon fights, duels, and sheriffs too tired to care. But if you walked through a real Western town in the 1880s, you'd find something closer to order. Main Street wasn't filled with shootouts. It was filled with routine. Blacksmiths pounding horseshoes, shopkeepers sweeping doorways, kids chasing stray dogs through the dust. Towns like Dodge City and Tombstone weren't war zones. They were communities trying to build a future in the middle of nowhere. Most had strict laws, posted right at the edge of town. No guns beyond this point. No liquor after midnight. Sometimes even, no cursing in public. In Dodge City, you could be fined for carrying a firearm inside town limits. Tombstone had gun control long before the word existed, and in Abilene, Sheriff Wild Bill Hickok, the same man Hollywood turned into a gunslinging hero, actually banned guns altogether. The Wild West wasn't lawless. It was fragile, and those laws were how people held the chaos back. But quiet towns don't sell movie tickets, so Hollywood gave us gunfire instead of good sense. Because order isn't cinematic. Movement is, and if the frontier wasn't wild enough, the movies gave it motion. If you believe the westerns, everyone in the frontier rode tall in the saddle, dust flying, hat low, sunset behind them. But real life wasn't one long ride. Horses were expensive, fragile, and needed care. They were tools, not toys. Most folks walked, or hitched a ride in wagons, stagecoaches, or trains when they could afford it. By 1880, railroads had stretched like veins across the continent, carrying cattle, mail, and people in search of something better. You could go from Kansas to California faster than a horse could recover from the trip. The iron horse changed everything. Still, we remember the saddle, not the steam. Because a man on horseback looks like freedom. And the Western has always been a love letter to that illusion. The open horizon. The lone rider. The idea that one person can outrun the world. But out here, even the horizon came with rules. And when the day's ride ended, whether by boot, wheel, or train, everyone needed a place to rest. And that's where the myth truly comes alive. Hollywood's saloon is a cathedral of adventure. Golden light, polished bar, a friendly bartender pouring whiskey that never runs out. But the real saloons? They smelled like sweat, smoke, and desperation. Most were rough wooden shacks, crowded and dim. The floor was sticky. The air was thick. A single kerosene lamp hung crookedly from the ceiling. Whiskey was often watered down or dangerously strong, sometimes cut with turpentine or tobacco juice. And the men who drank it weren't outlaws or heroes. They were workers. Cowhands, miners, drifters trying to wash the dust off their throats for a nickel a glass. Women were rarely welcomed unless they were working, and even then it wasn't glamorous. Native patrons were banned from many bars entirely. In truth, the saloon wasn't a stage for gunfights and glory. It was a mirror, reflecting every hardship, every vice, every piece of hope left at the bottom of a glass. But movies need light, not truth. And in the flicker of that light, a dirty saloon became the heart of the legend. But every legend needs an ending, a place where the dust finally settles. And Hollywood gave the frontier one of its own. A curtain call in golden light, one final sunset. The movies tell us the West ended neatly. The railroads came, the towns grew, the cowboys rode into the sunset, and civilization claimed the land. But the truth? The frontier didn't end, it just changed shape. Its spirit drifted into oil fields, mining camps, and boom towns. It lived on in drifters and dreamers, in families still carving out a living from land that never gave up its fight. Even into the early 1900s, pockets of the old frontier remained, isolated, untamed, stubbornly alive. And maybe it never really went away at all. Because that hunger for space, that fight to define freedom, it's still in us. Every road trip, every rebellion, every story of a lone wanderer against the odds, that's the frontier breathing through time. The West didn't die. It became an idea, one we keep riding back to again and again because it tells us who we wish we were. Hollywood gave it a closing scene. History never did. So maybe the real Wild West wasn't about gunfights or heroes or even freedom. Maybe it was about endurance, about people too stubborn to quit, too hopeful to give up. It wasn't a story of black and white hats. It was a story of dust, mistakes, and the relentless will to start again. And that's why it never fades. Because deep down we all have a little Wild West left in us. And the truth? It's even better than the legend. The Wild West we grew up with was never real. But somehow, it still means something. It's the idea that one person, against all odds, can stand their ground. That freedom is worth chasing, even if the horizon never stops moving. That grit still matters more than glory. The movies gave us myths. History gave us the truth. And somewhere between the two lies the heart of America's most enduring legend. So now it's your turn to ride. Which of these myths surprised you the most? Which one changed how you see the Wild West? Tell me down below. And if you love uncovering the truth behind the legend, saddle up and hit that subscribe button. Because out here, every story hides a secret, and we're just getting started.